gentleman on the television. This is my very dear, beloved friend, Gerald Swick. I've known Gerald for many years. We actually met. Did we meet in Madison? We met in Madison, Indiana, when we were both doing some research on Emily Todd Helm. And since then, we have journeyed a couple of times together and done some wonderful research in Kentucky. And Gerald has written 3 books on West Virginia. And he was just telling us about a book he wrote, and I missed the title of it. So I have to tell you about
Well, I don't think the title of this one on the 1st Infantry Division has been fully decided yet.
Okay.
We're still playing with that, I believe.
But it's this kind of,
While we're talking about books I wrote, I'll show you one of them even has one of our favorite people on the cover. Oh, it's not showing up at all, is it? That's interesting. I've got the background blurred, so I didn't realize it also blurred the foreground.
yes, it does. So anyway, with that, Gerald is an author. He has worked with newspapers for years. He has done editing. He is a great historian. He is a great researcher when it comes to the Lincoln family and the Todds and Civil War history. He knows anything and everything there is to know about military history. I'm very happy and I'm very proud that he's my friend. So here's Gerald Swick.
Yay!
Yay, Gerald!
Thank you very much. When Donna contacted me about this, she told me that you wanted me to speak to you about Mary's relationship with her brother, Dr. George Rogers Clark Todd. Is that correct?
We can listen to anything you want to talk about.
Okay, well, Mary didn't have a relationship with her brother, George Rogers Clark Todd. So thank you for inviting me. I've had a good time. That is the Reader's Digest version, but it's pretty accurate. And I'm going to explain why in a little bit. I know all of you are well versed in Mary. And by the way, before we get off that, before we talk, still talking about books, Donna, I had so much GRC material to go through getting ready for this. The folders stack about a foot tall when I sit them on the floor. And your Mary Lincoln Demystified, that timeline of Mary saved me a lot of time. So I'm very grateful for it.
You're welcome.
Now, all of you know Mary, know her intimately, and you may have your opinions on GRC, George Rogers Clark Todd, but you may find some things, hopefully you will learn some things this evening that show that he cannot be, he was as complex and contradictory as Mary was, and it's pretty hard to pigeonhole him, although he is certainly much easier to caricature than she is. He had a well-deserved reputation for towering rages, heavy drinking, and being an unpleasant, disagreeable cuss. And speaking of cussing, he was extraordinarily profane, probably partly to control his stuttering. For some odd reason, people don't stutter when they cuss. And when a friend warned him he was going to go to hell if he didn't stop cussing, George told him, "That'll be all right with me. All my real friends are already there." Here are some descriptions of George from people who knew him in Barnwell, South Carolina, where he spent the last 30 years of his life. Very peculiar and eccentric, drank whiskey to excess, would seem very pleasant when he wanted to be, but generally was not agreeable. He did not get along with people. He was very bright and well-informed, but very egotistical and extremely jealous of his professional reputation. This person who said that, who was another doctor in Barnwell, said that George told him his family regarded him unfavorably. He used the term black sheep, which I think is quite fair. George's attorney in Barnwell said that he had peculiarities and was highly esteemed and honored. He took no pains to conceal his dislike for those who had incurred his displeasure, refused to consort with his own contemporaries to any great extent. But George's obituary in the Barnwell newspaper said, "In the relief of suffering, he found his highest happiness. To the poor, he was always very kind and dispensed genuine, unostentatious charity. He had many friends who will sadly miss him. Nothing improves somebody's reputation like dying, so you might want to take that with a little bit of grain of salt. But there is some evidence that he was very concerned about the poor and tried to help them. In 1994, I traveled to Barnwell, and I interviewed a Black man there known locally and very affectionately as Uncle Henry Hayes. He was 114 years old, and when he was a boy, he was treated by GRC, who told his father, teach that boy how to chew tobacco so he won't get worms. And on the autumn afternoon, we were sitting on Uncle Henry's back porch. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pouch of beech nut, took out a chew. And I'd read the story in the local history, so I laughed and said, I see you're still chewing your tobacco, Uncle Henry. And he said, yep, yes, sir. Uncle Todd, Dr. Todd told me to. He had nothing but good things to say about Todd. And he told me that GRC even taught a young Black man the rudiments of medicine so that he could take over some of George's Black patients. On that same visit, I interviewed a woman who lived in the house that had been GRC's last home and his office. She had known an elderly woman who, as a girl, would go with her sister over to George's, and they would fill quinine tablets for him, capsules. He'd pay them about a penny, and then he'd stick his dog Tige on them to send them screaming home. It was obviously a game. They did this over and over. But one day, this woman's mother sent her to fetch the doctor because their cow was having a problem giving birth. And when the girl told Dr. Todd what her mother wanted, he flew into one of his rages, told her, get out of here. I'm a people doctor, not an animal doctor. His rages must have been really frightening because this woman said that from then on, as long as he was alive, she crossed the street when she had to walk in front of his house. So she walked down the other side. So you get the idea here. George was pretty complex. As to the relationship between him and Mary, let's take a look at the chronology of their lives, and that will explain why there wasn't really a lot of closeness between them, in my opinion. Mary, of course, was born December 13th, 1818, and George on July 4th, 1825. So Mary's 6.5 years old when he's born. You all know that their mother died the next day after giving birth to him. And I've never seen anything one way or the other about this, but it is possible that, at least on an emotional level, if not an intellectual one, Mary may have blamed him for what she called her desolate childhood. I will tell you, I know that my father was married. I am the only child of my mother and father, but my father was married to a woman before who had been twice widowed, had children from both of those marriages, and then she and dad had children, the last of which was my half-sister Linda. And then their mother died within a couple of years of uterine cancer. And one of Linda's half-sisters told her it was her fault that she had killed their mother. So I do know that this can happen in families. Again, did Mary feel that way? I don't know, but it is something that is a possibility. At any rate, the next year, she starts going to Dr. Ward's Shelby Female Academy. So she's going to that school 5 days a week, coming home in the evening. He believed in education by memorization, so it's pretty safe to assume she had a lot of memorizing homework to do, and really wouldn't have had a lot of time with the new baby, even if she was inclined to be with him. Then in the autumn of 1832, I think I may have, no, in the autumn of 1832, she enters Mintel's for young ladies. And at that point, George is 7 years old. He's almost 11 when she graduates. But Mary is 14 when she enters and nearly 18 when she graduates. And if any of you were teenagers who had siblings who were that much younger than you, think about how much time you voluntarily spent with them. And we know Mary was vivacious, outgoing, and it's very likely that when she came home from Intel's on the weekend, that she was off with her friends and not really, especially since she didn't care for her stepmother and the second family, and would not have been around George much. He grew up with a second family, which would have made him an outsider to them, very possibly. And his own childhood, and even if that wasn't the case, he was almost 5 years older than Sam and almost 7 years older than David, the two oldest boys. So again, I doubt that they did a lot together, maybe swimming in the creek behind the house. George grows up and goes to Center College in Danville, graduates in 1843 with an AB degree. While he's at Center College, Mary and Lincoln meet, break up, get back together, get married, and they have their first two children. Then in November 1847, the Lincolns arrive in Lexington with their two children for a 3-week visit while Lincoln's on his way to Congress. GRC later remembered that from this time that Lincoln was 6 foot 6 inches tall with black hair, a dark complexion, and blue eyes. But they were only there for 3 weeks this time, and George has already started to Transylvania University, where he's studying medicine. And from his dissertation and his later reputation as a physician and surgeon, it's obvious that he really applied himself to his studies. So again, how much time he and Mary would have spent together is questionable. She's back by the following April, but leaves again to go to Washington. She's back there by September. So you take the 3 weeks in November and that spring and summer, Mary and George are around each other for only a total of about 6 months. And that is the most time she will spend around him since he was a child. So basically, they never really had much of an opportunity to build a relationship between them. Later, when the family lawsuits come up, and I'll get to those in a minute, George claimed that he had been forced to leave his father's home because his stepmother's constant efforts to poison his father's mind against me. It occurs to me that it's entirely possible. Maybe Betsy wanted to get the last of the children from the first marriage out. But I think it's also possible that she may have been trying to get Robert Smith Todd to face reality about George's eccentric behavior. And I think he was probably already drinking pretty heavily by this point, or at least had gotten into imbibing. Again, this is speculation on my part. I've never seen anything to that effect. But George returned home and his father offered to pay his tuition in medical school. So if he left his father's house, it had to be between his graduation from Center College in 1843 and entering Transylvania in 1845. His half-brother David went off to the Mexican War. And in a letter from May 1848 that David wrote to his mother, David says, "Tell the doctor that he will not have to sleep in a room by himself very long." So apparently David and GRC were sharing a bedroom before David went off to the war. George is listed in the Transylvania College Medical Department 1845 through 1848. And in the academic index, 1846. He submitted his dissertation, Young Physic, January 20th, 1848. And in this dissertation, he shows himself to be, by the way, the dissertation quite poetic in places. George did have a flair for metaphors when he wanted to use them. It decried those who engage in medicine strictly for financial gain, and again, when he was in Barnwell, he instituted basically an insurance policy that families could pay him $50 and he would treat their family for the entire year for that $50. So that would have certainly helped many of the people there, but it was also would have helped George because he had trouble collecting. He ran a notice in the Barnwell paper saying people are going to have to pay their bills or find another doctor. So this would have been a way of assuring he had income. His dissertation does show him to be a questioner of tradition and a lover of personal observation and reasoned intellect. And I think those traits probably played a role in him becoming what that doctor in Barnwell described as a perfect agnostic, which is, of course, in contrast to Mary's Christian faith and her belief in spiritualism. I can only imagine if George ever heard about Mary's spiritualism, he would have probably made several profane remarks about it.
Yes, I do.
The dissertation also goes on at length for the needs to physicians to be open to new forms of treatment, because he said in the last 5 years, there have been dramatic increases in science and medicine. During the Civil War, he cured a tumor on the jaw of a private he just gave him medicine, didn't use surgery, for which the private was very pleased because that's most people would have just done the surgery. And long after the war, when George was in Barnwell, there was a young man who came down with typhoid. Family brought in doctors from as far away as Charleston. Barnwell, by the way, is over close to Augusta, Georgia. And they brought in doctors from far away as Charleston. All of them told the family there was no hope. But according to the story, George told everybody to get out of the room. He gave the patient 50 grains of quinine, bathed him in a solution, and the man lived to be 60 years old, or lived for almost another 60 years.
Wow. Wow.
Now, July 16th, 1849, a date that I am sure you're all well acquainted with. It's when Mary and George's father dies without a will, and that sets off what I call the lawsuit years that dragged on into the mid-50s. I'm not going to get into the weeds of those lawsuits to any degree. William H. Townsend has described them pretty well, and others have gone into it. But I will tell you what I regard as the saddest story to come out of those. In October 1852, George obtained 2 of the family slaves from Betsy Humphreys. They were named Harvey and Penn. And George, in his testimony in one of the lawsuits, said that Harvey was anxious to be near his wife, who was owned by Mr. Bell between Georgetown and Frankfort. GRC arranged to sell Harvey to Greenup Remington of Cynthiana, which is about 30 miles north of Lexington. And he successfully prevailed upon a Mr. Webb of Harrison County, where Cynthiana is located, to buy the wife and children. So George actually made the effort, according to his testimony, to bring this enslaved family close together where they could see each other. But the court decided that they were part of the family estate, ordered that all the slaves be assessed, their value be determined, and someone found to buy them. If that didn't happen, then they were to be sold at public auction. And I believe that is what happened. So I have no idea where Harvey wound up. George offered to buy both of them and all the others for $5 above the assessed value, but he was turned down. Ironically, when he brought this suit against his father's estate, he was obviously hoping to get money. Why else do it? But he never saw a penny from it because he gave his interest in the estate to a man named Daniel Breck to pay off a note for $800 and $900 that George owed him. By 1849 or 1850, you'll frequently read that George graduated Transylvania in 1850. His name is not on that list of graduates. The class of 1851 is missing. but he is in Cynthiana by 1849 or 1850. He opened a medical practice there. The two doctors that were in the town had died of the same cholera epidemic that killed George's father. But soon there were other doctors, and there were four, including George, there were four doctors in town. So there was competition in the small town among the doctors. He ran a business card ad in the Cynthiana Weekly News, but by February 1853, that ad no longer appears. And given the problems that George was having with money at that time, again, speculation, but as an old advertising salesman here, I suspect he may no longer have been able to pay his advertising bill. He married Anne Curry, the daughter of Judge James Curry in Cynthiana, on October 22nd, 1851. And they honeymooned in Niagara, which means he beat Mary there by about 6 years. A daughter was born to them in 1850 in September 19th, 1852, which is just a bit over 6 months before Mary gave birth to Tad. The daughter's name was Martha. The county history indicates that she was known as Mattie D, D-E-E. Her headstone shows only the middle initial D. That headstone also gives her birth year as 1858, which is 6 years later than she was actually born. So she was a true Todd woman, shaving years off of her age. For a while, George did have money to invest in land speculation. I'm guessing this probably came partly from his grandmother's estate, partly from his medical practice, and very likely by borrowing money, which was very common for land speculation. But he and his wife had an interest in about 530 acres in Harrison County. 6 days after they bought it, they sold 100 acres of it, and a 22-year-old man named Henry for a total of $110. And then over the next couple of years, they sold 200 more acres on the charmingly named Snake Lick Creek. It sounds like a great spot for a boutique motel, doesn't it? George was not yet finished with bringing the lawsuit. So first one, I believe, was when he filed a complaint against Noah S. Keller for committing trespass, assault, and battery in December of 1850. And George claimed he was left wounded and lame for several days from the beating that Keller gave him. I did not find any details on what precipitated this. Given George's ability to win friends or to lose friends and alienate people, it's entirely possible he said the wrong thing to the wrong man. But again, speculation. Don't have it in the record at hand. During his years in Cynthiana, Mary and Lincoln's fortunes are on the rise. Both his legal practice and his political career, GRCs are going in the other direction. And he is listed as a plaintiff in 13 lawsuits between 1851 and 1856, including one against Greenup Remington, the guy he sold Harvey to. That was over a house that he bought from Greenup for himself and his wife, and then found out that a portion of the lot belonged to the church next door. So he had a much smaller lot than he thought he had purchased. There are a lot of suits. He even at one point bought a suit that named his father-in-law. Now, bring a suit against your father-in-law is bad enough, but doing it against a father-in-law who is a judge, let's just say that George's temper probably got the better of him there. George was named himself in several suits where people were suing him for money owed. He never even paid his attorney $125 that he owed him. And Donna, I believe that rings bells about Levi and his attorney, brother Levi.
Brother Levi?
I think that he had the same situation where he owed his attorney couldn't collect from him.
Right.
By February 1856, George's father-in-law testifies that George is insolvent. He has abandoned his wife and child and has moved out of state. but he may have moved out of state, may have moved back in. He did come to see his daughter for about 30 minutes one time and asked his father-in-law to bring her to Lexington so he could see her again. But on August 31st, 1859, Anne filed for divorce. William H. Townsend in Lincoln in the Bluegrass says that she claimed cruelty, and that is entirely possible that he was. I imagine he was both verbally and possibly physically abusive. But all she says in her statement is desertion and abandonment. He is obviously, he's drinking heavily at this point and will continue to do so. And I think that probably accounts for a lot of his economic problems in Cynthiana. He disappears for a while, but by early 1860, he's a surgeon with the Texas Rangers, camped out near the headwaters of the San Saba River. And there was a controversy here because Governor Sam Houston learned that, heard that there was whiskey in the camp, and he had given strict orders against that. So he wrote about it, and I wrote to the commander about it. The aide, Lieutenant James S. Gillette, answered and said that Gillette, had brought a package addressed to GRC to the camp, left it in the medical tent because George was away, but he had no idea what was in the package because he and the doctor weren't talking. So we have indication here, again, that George was probably bringing in whiskey and probably not for his patients. Houston ordered that every bottle be seized and destroyed except one for medical purposes. And it also shows that George, once again, winning friends with his personality, that the lieutenant wasn't speaking to him. The Ranger Company was disbanded in April of 1860. And then comes November 1860, when the feces hits the oscillator. Lincoln is elected president, his party sweeps the northern elections, South Carolina secedes on December 20th, and the following spring, the Civil War begins. George reportedly was practicing medicine in New Orleans when the war began, but he went to Richmond to enlist as a surgeon in the Confederate Army. Whereupon he was pretty quickly arrested, citizen's arrest, and jailed for making incendiary language. He had been heard loudly denouncing several Confederate military leaders and calling them damn traitors. And interestingly, part of the evidence they used to show that he was against the Confederacy there was he was carrying one or more letters franked to him at Lexington by A. Lincoln, MC. And the MC probably stands for Member of Congress. These letters were probably franked during Lincoln's term there. What they said, I have no idea. That was not recorded. And why he was carrying them when he was going to enlist in the Confederate Army, I don't know, unless they said something that he could show, look, Lincoln and I have no love for each other. Look what he said about me. Again, we have to guess at that. But George was soon freed because several people came forward and testified that he was a good Southern man. And one said that Todd, excuse me, just one second. One man told him that Todd always said to him that he regarded Lincoln as the greatest scoundrel unhung. So while he's in Richmond, George goes to see his half-brother David, who is a guard at a prison there. And David, who once shared a bedroom with him, refuses to see him. That lawsuit George brought against the family is where I believe he becomes the black sheep of the family. David's sister Elodie wrote that when she heard about this, that she was glad David refused to see him. George is known to have treated wounded at the Battle of Malvern Hill, part of the 7 Days campaign outside Richmond. It's on July 1st, 1862. And I think this is where the story begins, that he performed the first successful amputation at the hip. He did apparently perform the amputation successfully, but that had already been done by a British surgeon during the Crimean War in which was 1853 to 1856. In May, and this is, I think, more than anything else in this speech, this is going to be what really interests you. In May 1863, a captured Union surgeon recorded in his diary that he had the pleasure of meeting and working with GRC. This was surgeon is Dr. Daniel M. Holt, and they worked together after the Battle of Salem Church, which is part of the Chancellorsville campaign. He described George as short, rather inferior looking, with an impediment in his speech. And Holt told him that he had had the pleasure of seeing George's sister, Mrs. Lincoln, a few days before the battle at a corps service, CORPS service. And George replied, "Well, I don't know if I feel the better or the worse for that. She is a poor, weak-minded woman anyhow." And that is the only statement I have ever found of George expressing an opinion about Mary. If any of you are aware of another one, please let me know. And I don't know of Mary ever making a statement about George specifically. She talked about her Confederate brothers, who, of course, that led to all the suspicion against her, but she didn't I'm not aware of her ever referring to George specifically. By the end of September 1863, he's out in the Western Theater, surgeon to the 10th Georgia Regiment in the Army of Tennessee. And then later he's put in charge of a prison hospital at Rikersville near Charleston, South Carolina. One man who had been a prisoner in the infamous Andersonville prison camp and was sent to Rikersville said that we received very good treatment at Rikersville. And he mentioned George was the surgeon in charge. However, other prisoners testified that George was cruel, that he would often kick the bodies of dead Union soldiers and call them damned abolitionists. One account says that during his fits of madness, he would pound and kick officers and then order them bucked and gagged. That treatment killed one officer from Kentucky. And George, when he heard he died, he said, "Well, I'm damn glad of it. I intended to kill him before he left here anyway." Some of the prisoners said that George was the most vicious wretch I ever saw, the most depraved rebel we encountered. And on at least 2 occasions, he had members of the United States colored troops who had been captured at Morris Island whipped for incurring his displeasure. And one of them he ordered to have 40 lashes. Undoubtedly, the prisoners at Rikersville were very pleased when George was reassigned. He was sent to Camden in the interior of South Carolina to take charge of the wayside hospitals there. And wayside or way hospitals are something that was established by the Confederate legislature at the beginning of May 1863. And they were located along railroads, and they were places where wounded or sick Confederate soldiers on furlough could stop and get food and shelter, or if they were on their way home and needed a place to stop on the way. When Sherman's troops came through South Carolina and were approaching Camden, George must have gotten very frightened because it appears he took off in a hurry. There's a report from one of the soldiers says that they found a carriage said to belong to the brother of President Lincoln, wrecked along the road to Cheraw, I believe is how the town's pronounced. One of the local women taking soup and flowers to the soldiers in these wayside hospitals at Camden was Martha Belton Lyles, known as Mattie. She's described as a rare beauty, very charming. And she was more than 20 years younger than George, but they began a relationship, married in Camden in December of 1866, and then went to Albany, Georgia, where GRC was already in a partnership with a doctor for the practice of medicine, midwifery, and surgery. After a couple of years in Albany, they moved to Barnwell. George is in the 1870 census there, and that's where they spend the rest of their lives. They're said to have had a very happy marriage, puttering, as George called it, with their roses. They had a daughter who died when she was 2 or 3, and a son, George B., who is also referred to as George Jr. I'll get back to him in a minute. George's wife died at the age of 48 after a long illness, and she died on July 5th, 1889, which is one day after George's 64th birthday. He is said to have fallen into a deep melancholy at various periods thereafter. He was well known for his medical skills, said to have treated the injured in the 1886 Charleston earthquake, which was the strongest earthquake ever recorded on the southeast coast. I have one story I have to tell. It's probably apocryphal, but if so, it shows what people thought of George's surgical skills. One day, a small boy fell off of a porch and cut off a piece of his ear. The nurse grabbed him, carried him to George, and George says, "Where's the piece of ear?" And she said, "Well, I didn't bring it, but I saw a rooster pecking in the general area." So George goes over, cuts open the craw of the rooster, takes out the piece of ear, sews it back onto the boy. The ear is fine, and it is said that the rooster survived too.
He's a magician.
What people thought of his skills. George died in April 1900. About a month earlier, he had damaged his spine in a fall, cracked his marrow, as he put it. And you remember Mary also suffered a bad fall in 1879 that hurt her back. George is believed to have committed euthanasia with chloroform. He's buried beside his wife in Camden, and he rewrote his will just before he died to entirely cut out his son, George B. And the county histories say this is because George B. had a wandering foot. He had gone out west, and GRC thought they should have stayed home to take care of him. That is entirely likely. I could see George doing that. But there's one other possibility that may have contributed to this. George B. is said to have roomed with Robert Todd Lincoln in Chicago.
Oh.
And it is a fact that George B. named his first son Robert and his second son Lincoln. And I'm surprised there wasn't an earthquake in Camden from George turning over in his George B. did have other children, and he lost 2 of them and his wife in the influenza pandemic. So around 1920, he takes the remaining children and sails from Port Royal, never to return to the area. But he didn't take all the children. There was one, a 20-year-old named Henry Paul, that they apparently just abandoned in Port Royal. The chief of police there bought a ticket for him and sent him to live with one of Henry's cousins on his mother's side. And he became known as Cuz throughout the rest of his life. He lived until 1960s, I think 1963. But I tell you that because Robert Todd Lincoln sent money for his support repeatedly. And after Lincoln died, his daughters continued to send support. I'm going to ask if you have any questions, and I'll try to answer them. And then just before we wrap up, I'd like to tell you something about what you might say about George when you're in the persona of Mary. Yes.
I have a question. This is Donna. Okay, so you mentioned, and I'm going to pick your brain here. You mentioned that when GRC didn't inherit anything from his father's estate, he was helping, and the man's name was Daniel Breck. Is that what you said?
Oh, George, yeah, Daniel Breck. George gave him his interest in his father's estate to pay off an $800 to $900 note.
Isn't he a relative?
That I do not know.
You
are far, I will say, you are far more well-versed in the spread out Todd genealogy than probably anybody else on earth.
I'm going to have to look it up when I get home, but I'm thinking that one of Robert Smith Todd's siblings married a Brett.
Didn't Elodie?
No,
Entirely
Elodie-
possible.
And Elodie's middle name was Brett.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, that's why I thought Elodie.
That's right. I forgot that. Yes.
Yeah, so,
Well, let me know when you check that out, what you find out. Will you, Donna?
yeah, well, no problem.
Any other questions?
Questions? Pam, do you have any questions?
No.
Nope. I thought it was an
I
excellent
thought it
talk.
was an excellent talk. I
Oh,
thought it
yes.
you answered a lot of questions.
Oh, Elizabeth has a question.
Can you explain a little bit more about how Robert Todd paid for this child? How did he find out about it? And, how-
It's in the county history, Barnwell County history.
Well, it's also in the Robert Todd Lincoln papers here in Springfield. There are the letters that go back and forth. And Robert Lincoln helped this family so much that as the kids were growing up, the man sent his children's report cards to Robert so that he would see how they were doing in school.
That's fascinating. When I was in Springfield, I was doing research on the Todds and did not look at the Robert Todd Lincoln file there. I should have. That's very interesting to know, Donna. Thank you.
There is a lot in the files about it. And apparently Robert got the guy, I may have this backwards a little bit, but Robert got his cousin a job with the Pullman Car Company. I want to say Walla Walla, Washington, or something like that. And the man was injured, and that was or started Robert beginning to pay all this man's bills because he paid all these medical bills.
Oh.
And then
I'm sorry, what was that about Walla Walla, Washington?
I think that's where the man ended up. He was in a hospital somewhere, and it's in my file. I tell you what, you don't even have to wait for me to look at my file. It is probably in Jason Emerson's book,
Yeah.
Giant in the Shadows.
I guarantee you.
If so, I've
Remember something.
read portions of the book. I haven't read it all yet. It's one of those books that you mine rather than sit down and read.
Right.
Yeah.
But
It's an easy read.
I will tell you that the story in Barnwell is that when Cuz died, he was in a funeral home there.
Yeah.
Because one woman wanted to go see him, another woman took her over. And when the woman came back out of the funeral home, the woman asked her, well, how did Cuz look? And she said, dead, like Abraham Lincoln all alive.
Yeah, but this guy who ended up working for Pullman Car Company might have been his son.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry, I misunderstood you.
Yeah.
That is entirely.
He's ignoring us.
Let me-
Yes.
If you have any other questions, I'll be happy to answer them, but let me tell you what you might say when you're in Mary's persona and you're talking first person. If someone asks about George, you would explain to them that because of the difference in your ages and because of you going to Springfield, that the two of you did not have a lot of time together. You might mention that 6 months when Lincoln was in Congress. And during the lawsuit, when Abraham and Mary Lincoln come back to Lexington a couple of times, Mary and George may not even have seen each other. It's very likely that they were just given depositions, and George was living in Cynthiana at that time. So 30 miles was quite a trip in those days. But at any rate, you can tell them that the two of you just didn't have a lot of time together, so you didn't get to develop, shall we say, much of a bond with him. You can tell them what you think as Mary, what you think, but as Mary, about the lawsuit against the father's estate. You can tell them that he described you as a poor, weak-minded woman.
Yep.
And what do you think of that? And you can say that you heard he was, during the war, you heard he was a brilliant physician and surgeon, but that he was also cruel to prisoners of war. And all of the Confederate Todds caused problems for your reputation and your standing in Washington. brought a lot of suspicion upon you.
Mhm.
If you want to be charitable,
Charitable.
you might tell them to take pity on one whose childhood may have been lonelier than your own.
Yeah.
Uh,
I never thought of
growing up with a second family, his stuttering, which probably brought ridicule, and someone whose personal demons drove him to excessive whiskey throughout most of his life.